In Chapter 10, we are going to focus on different nutritional needs required for fitness and sports. Some of our learning outcomes are just looking at the benefits of physical activity, developing a fitness plan, how energy is actually used. We'll talk about the needs for like different proteins and carbs to enhance performance, and kind of end this chapter in the next presentation talking about ergonic acids or aids that help with that, and things like blood doping and steroids and how they are used. All right, so first of all, physical activity. So we've already mentioned before about the importance of having physical activity. So first of all, just understanding that physical activity and physical fitness and exercise are not all the same thing. So somebody can be physically active, which just means any movement of skeletal muscles. So if you are twitching, fidgeting, kind of bumping your leg, that is physical activity. That is not exercise. And those don't necessarily indicate physical fitness. So while physical activity is anything in which your body is actually moving that needs energy, exercise, those are activities that are planned and repetitive. And the goal then of exercise would be to improve physical fitness. So the actual idea of how physically fit, so thinking about endurance or muscle training or something to that effect, would actually be accomplished using exercise, which is different though than just being physically active. So we look at some of the different activities. There are moderate intensity exercises or activities. So moderate intensity, this is aerobic activity, meaning that we're still using oxygen. We'll get more into the need for oxygen a little later on. But the goal here is to increase the heart rate and the breathing. And this would include things like a brisk walk, dancing, swimming, bicycling on level terrain. So again, just kind of your heart rate's up a little bit, but we're not, moving at a high speed, and we're able to keep up with the oxygen demand. Then vigorous intensity. This is where it's still using some aerobic activity using oxygen, but this greatly increases the heart rate and breathing, typically above what our cells can kind of maintain with oxygen. So again, we'll kind of come back to that. So this would be more like running, jogging, tennis, swimming, if we're doing continuous laps, or bicycling uphill where more energy is exerted. And then we also have muscle strengthening, so lifting weights. So this idea here is not so much worried about the heart rate and the breathing, but this increases skeletal muscle, their strength and power, also endurance and mass. So things like strength training, resistance training, so again, lifting weights, endurance, so marathon training, that type of thing. Those are examples of muscle strengthening. And this is just kind of looking at all the benefits of physical activity, and mainly just understanding it's very beneficial. So it helps with mental health, thinking about decreasing anxiety and dementia. Also, even cancers can be reduced by good physical activity. Decreasing heart issues like hypertension, increases our bone health. So a variety of benefits, all from physical activity. So those physical activity guidelines, again, we kind of mentioned these earlier in the semester, but just to come back to them, the recommendation is at least 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity, and that's brisk walking, elevating the heart rate. Doesn't have to be intense exercise, but again, 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity, or if you're moving up to that vigorous intensity, then 75 to 150 minutes a week of that vigorous aerobic activity, or an equivalent of combining those. In a lot of exercise routines, you may be briskly walking one day, you may be jogging the next. So again, some kind of equivalent combination of adding those together and spreading those activities throughout the week instead of if you're exercising 100 or even 75 minutes of the vigorous, spread that out throughout the week instead of doing it all in one day. And then just overall moving more, sitting less. So getting up, even if you do have a lifestyle where you're sitting more, that you get up and move around throughout the day. And then for additional or more extensive health benefits, so that's just kind of the baseline. Then if we're really trying to increase, so maybe we're trying to lose weight or decrease our risk of hypertension or those types of things, in order to get to that level, we need to increase that activity beyond the 300 minutes of moderate intensity per week, or more than 150 minutes of the vigorous activity, again, or an equivalent combination. So adults should also include muscle strengthening, so again, kind of like weightlifting or resistance training, use body weights that involve all the major groups, at least 2 or more days a week. And just some stats here, about 80% of Americans fail to achieve those levels of physical activity that are set forth here, which then, along with poor diet, adds to the increase in obesity. So just assessing your current level. So of course, just start by looking at your current level of fitness. So men over 40, women over 50 are encouraged to discuss their goals with their primary care provider. And then fitness professionals can then help with a safe start and realistic goals. And then also there are some health problems that require some evaluation. So if somebody is obese, again, you should consult a healthcare professional to help come up with a good plan for that. CVD, high blood pressure, diabetes, again, chest pains or arthritis. While physical activity and nutrition can help with those, these are larger problems that may need additional support. So setting your goals, this just helps enhance your success. So sports dietitians are good to contact about these. These are trained professionals, and they just help you set those reasonable physical activity goals based on where you're at right now. These are board certified specialists in sports dietitian. They're called CSSDs, and they're, again, credentialed to work with sports nutrition in the US. Also, there are so many now things like Fitbits and apps, so wearable fitness devices like pedometers, and again, these smartphone apps just help motivate you, especially if you're sitting for a long time. Again, it kind of alerts or notifies you to get up and walk around. So planning your program, balanced fitness programs are the best, where you have various types of activity. So just like our diet, where we need a variety of foods, our fitness needs a variety of activities. So it could include aerobic, muscle and bone strengthening, as well as flexibility. So the best program follows what's referred to as the FIT principle, F-I-T-T, where F stands for frequency. So this is referring to the number of days a week. The intensity, so how hard you're working, what your heart rate or resistance is, how long each session would be, which is T for the time, and then the other T is the type of exercise. So again, running, jogging, what is that? So setting realistic goals that incorporate all 4 of those principles, or all 4 of those criteria, are important. All right, and this is just a table here that looks at one example of a well-rounded fitness program. So you can look at, again, the FIT, frequency, intensity, time, and type, to come up with that FIT. And again, just looking at the different types. So if we're looking at aerobic fitness, muscular fitness, or flexibility, depending on our goals, and just what that fitness program might look like. All right, so our aerobic exercises help with cardiovascular endurance, so just keeping the heart beating at a higher level for longer. Aerobic just means with oxygen. This is using those large muscle groups to increase, again, the heart rate is the goal here. And so ways to determine that intensity is MHR, the maximum heart rate, so the percentage of age-predicted maximum heart rate, or the RPE scale, which is the rate of perceived exertion just meaning, again, how that's kind of varies for each person about how, usually on a scale of 1 to 10, how long they think they can endure that level of activity. So again, a 10 would be like running from the bear. You can only do that for a short amount of time. 1 is like you're breathing, and then everything in between there. So components of that aerobic activity, again, intensity, which is just how hard that person's working. Again, frequency, how often they're being engaged. And then duration is how long. So back to our FIT principle. So this is the frequency, the intensity, and then the time as well here. So determining that level of intensity. So the MHR, that age predicted maximum heart rate, is 220 minus the age. So if you're 20 years old, that you would want an MHR about 200. So for an initial program, you want to be at about half of that. So again, if you're 20 and we subtract the 220, your MHR, your maximum rate is 200. So for an initial program, you'd want to be around 100 on that scale. If you're doing an intermediate, so you've been working out for a while, you're kind of stepping it up, we want to go up to 60 to 75%. And then an experienced, you've been working out for a while, we're going to boost that up to 70 to 85%. So again, take 220 minus your age, and then depending on the percentage where you're at would help with that. So just an example over here again, 20-year-old, 220 minus 20, 200 MHR. So that initial program, 200 times 0.5 for 50%, or 0.65 for 65%. So somewhere between 100 and 130 beats per minute is what we're looking for in that heart rate for an initial program. So this heart rate training is just looking here again, that 90 to 100% of the MHR, that's maximum effort. So that's a sprint, that's going to be very short. Then 180 to 90, that's the anaerobic zone where we can't keep up with the oxygen. So again, shorter durations. The aerobic zone, which is where a lot of exercises kind of gauge, is 70 to 80%. 60 to 7 is more weight management, so just maintaining, and then 60 or 50 to 60 is kind of that heart health zone. So we want to get to at least that for having those heart benefits. So again, as we age, so as our age increases, then that maximum heart rate is going to decrease. So only around 80 or so, a heart rate of 80 is needed for those who are between 60 and 70 years old looking for that kind of heart health zone. And again, their maximum effect, the maximum heart rate is actually only around about 150 for those who are around 70 years old. Now the rate of perceived exertion, or RPE, again, this is a scale of 1 to 10. So 0 would be at rest, so just sitting, not doing anything. 10, you're running for your life. So everything in between that. So the aim here is a number somewhere around 4 to up to about 7. So kind of the green here, so that we want to aim for somewhere in there, so at least a 4 to see some significant results. So it should be working hard, but still able to kind of to exercise or talk to a partner. So the talk test is what they call that. So again, anywhere in this range of 4 to 7, you're kind of out of breath, you can feel the effects, but you're not so exhausted that you can't carry on a conversation. All right, now if we look at this musculoskeletal fitness, this is talking about muscular strength, which is just the ability to exert a muscle force against a load at one time. So like pushing on something. Endurance is the ability to perform repeated submaximal contractions over time without the fatigue. And then power is going to be this, combines this strength with speed for those explosive moves like jumping or throwing. So this includes muscle strengthening. So it's good to include muscle strengthening a couple times each week. Then flexibility, So our flexibility declines with age. So these different exercises can enhance stability and balance that help prevent falls and hip fractures and all that good stuff. So this is just the ability to move a joint through a full range of motion. Again, the goal is to improve balance and stability, but again, it reduces the risk of falls, especially as we age. All right, so again, kind of looking here at a fitness plan, the goal mainly of what this is showing is that we're doing a variety of things. So we're doing some aerobics, some strength training, and some endurance throughout the week. So we're having a variety of different things multiple times each week. All right, warming up and cooling down is very important. We hear a lot of these about different exercise routines. It should always include a warm up and a cool down, which are both about 5 to 10 minutes. So that duration's the same. They're both low intensity here. Now, kind of the main difference is the stretching. So stretching is really good to do as part of the cool down. So that stretching is going to improve your stretching ability. It will help stretch the muscles after they're warmed up. Doing a lot of stretching before the workout actually is not as beneficial as doing it at the end. So once your muscles are warmed up, that's whenever you really want to work on stretching them. The idea of the warm up is just to increase the range of motion and decrease injury. So it's not so much about increasing that flexibility, it's just getting the body moving, warming it up before you exert a lot of exercise to it. All right, another main goal is just sticking with it. So once you have a physical activity plan, just maintaining it is the hardest part. So some things that are recommended to help stick with it, start slowly so that it's realistic. It's something you can see some gains with. Again, variety instead of just doing the same thing over and over. Make it social. And then, revisit both the short and long-term goals. Maybe after you're doing it a while, you can step it up. Maybe you need to scale it back. But again, adjust it before you just quit doing it, and make sure you have enough time each day. Reward yourself whenever you achieve different goals. And if you have an occasional setback, don't focus on it. Just forget it and keep moving. All right, now if we get more back to the nutrition side, so our energy sources for these active muscles. So the body converts that energy to what's called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. This is the main energy currency for our cells. So it holds chemical energy in the bonds that hold these atoms in this molecule together. So it's used during muscle contractions. It also is needed to pump different ions for like our nerves to work, and a lot of our enzyme activity. A little bit, but only a small amount, is stored in resting cells. So we have about 2 to 4 seconds worth of work. So again, a little bit of storage, but definitely not a lot. Now, we'll talk about aerobic as we already have, but there's also what's called anaerobic metabolism. So we'll start there first. So this is going to give us energy in short bursts of intense activity. So this is going to utilize that stored ATP. So these cells are constantly and repeatedly using and then reforming the ATP is the energy source. Phosphocreatinine, or PCR, is used to resupply that ATP. And then we can also break down glucose anaerobically, just meaning without oxygen, during intense physical activity like sprinting. This is done whenever those oxygen supplies are limited. So we can't breathe in enough oxygen to keep up with our energy demand. So we can switch to this anaerobic breakdown of glucose for short-term energy supply. All right, so if we look at this, what happens is there's this ongoing cycle. So there's ADP, which has these 2 phosphate groups, so diphosphate versus tri that has 3 phosphates. So there is energy held in the bonds that hold these phosphates together. So what happens is whenever ADP, when there's energy available from our food, then that a phosphate group is added on to ADP. Now we have 3 phosphates, and now we have ATP. If we need energy, then ATP gets rid of one of the phosphates and it goes back to ADP. But now it's released energy to do work. So this is how those cells convert that food energy from our foods into ATP. But then we can break those bonds to release the energy, and then that byproduct is ADP. But now whenever energy is available, it stores it, and we go back and forth through this little cycle to store little bits of energy at a time. All right, now phosphocreatinine, or PCR, is a high energy compound like ATP. Now this is used primarily during bursts of activity like lifting or jumping, where you don't need to really sustain it like our sprinting, but we need quick bursts, or that initial burst of energy. So it can sustain a muscle contraction about 15 seconds, but not much of this phosphocreatinine is stored in our muscles. Like ATP, it just kind of gets recycled, but we don't keep a lot of it around. So creatinine supplements sometimes are used in strength training athletes to increase the amounts of that phosphocreatinine, which gives more energy, allows more energy to be stored for those short bursts. So what happens here is that enzymes are going to split that phosphocreatinine into phosphate and creatinine. And then that phosphate releases energy to reform ATP. Right? So again, ADP only has the 2 phosphates. It's a low energy. But if we add a phosphate group to it, it gives us ATP, which stores more energy. So in some cases, that energy, that phosphate, comes from this molecule of phosphocreatinine. It gives up its phosphate to ADP, and then the creatinine is left over as a byproduct. So it's another source of getting that phosphate group to make ATP. Now in this anaerobic glucose breakdown, so instead of using phosphocreatinine, we can actually break down our foods, mainly glucose. So during intense physical activity, again sprinting, where we don't have a lot of oxygen to keep up with what we're asking our muscles to do, so we're talking about like 30 seconds up to about 2 minutes, then what's going to happen when oxygen isn't there, we switch to anaerobic breakdown. So we're still using glucose from our carbs, but instead of fully breaking it down to yield lots of energy in aerobic respiration, in anaerobic, that glucose is converted to what's called pyruvic acid, or pyruvate, and then that is further converted into lactic acid. Now that lactic acid can build up and it causes acidity that inhibits enzymes in our muscles. And that can cause muscle soreness and some other issues. So again, whenever we first start working out and we need those quick jolts of energy our body's not ready for, we use anaerobic. Again, that builds up some lactic acid that can cause some muscle pain, but it again can damage or inhibit some of the enzymes in our muscles. However, the reason our body does this is it replenishes ATP very quickly. So it gives us about 2 ATPs for every glucose. It's about 5% of that energy potential. So not a lot of energy for what's in the glucose, but we can get some energy really fast, but it cannot sustain that ATP production. So again, just very quick, up to about 2 minutes of work can be done with anaerobic. Now in aerobic metabolism, so during those low or moderate intense activities, glucose is made from glycogen. So remember, glycogen stores glucose in our liver. So the liver breaks down the glucose and breaks down glycogen and releases glucose into the blood. Now that aerobic glucose breakdown, whenever there's lots of oxygen around, that supplies a lot more ATP, but it releases energy slower. So again, that first couple minutes, 30 seconds to 2 minutes of quick energy comes from anaerobic. But then if we need activities lasting, 2 minutes to several hours, now we're going to use aerobic. We're going to use oxygen to efficiently break down our carbs. We get more ATP, even though it takes a little bit longer. So this is releasing about 95% of the ATP, is made by complete breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide and water. So much more energy efficient than what anaerobic is, but again, it takes a little longer. So if we look at this, again, here's our glucose molecule. It has 6 carbons. That's what our little 6 up here is looking at. Whenever we convert that to what's called pyruvate, or that pyruvic acid, it makes 2 of those. Both of them have 3 carbons. So all of our carbons are still hanging out. We just split the molecule into 2. The goal here, though, was to produce a little ATP. So we get 2 ATPs for each glucose. Now, in anaerobic, that pyruvate is converted to lactate or lactic acid. We're still keeping all of our carbons here from that molecule, but that's going to help keep glycolysis and that glucose, that anaerobic process happening. However, in aerobic, when we have lots of it, we completely break down those pyruvates into 6 carbon dioxides. So now all of those carbons from glucose have been released as carbon dioxide, and we get a little metabolic water in the form of H2O. But again, we get lots more ATP during that process, even though it takes a little longer. So this breakdown of carbohydrates, so whenever our muscles get depleted of glycogen, that carbohydrate store, then our glucose kind of hit a wall, so to speak. So to avoid that from all of our glycogen getting depleted, we want to have the maximum glycogen storage before exercise. So we have lots of glycogen stored up, and that will supply those carbohydrates during the activity. And then we want to replenish those glycogen stores in between our exercising events. All right, so now looking at fat, because we know that fat stores actually more energy than what our carbs do. So actually the majority of energy stored in the body is stored as fatty acids. And then that gets converted to ATP by our muscle cells. So we have glycogen we use kind of first, but then for long term, we're going to switch to fats. So this is released from our adipose tissue. That's where our fatty acids are stored. And then those are going to travel to the muscles to be used to release energy. So that used as activity increases from low to moderate pace. So as we move from that low into more moderate, we need a longer supply of energy. We switch over to that fat burning. And the fatty acids come from all over the body, not just necessarily right beside the muscles that we're activating. So this is why spot training or spot reducing doesn't really work. So like just working your abs isn't really the best way. Again, using all of your muscles to deplete the fat stores from all over the body, because again, just because you're working the abs, it might actually be using fat from your legs to supply your abs with energy. So again, spot reducing isn't the best form for working out. Now continuing here with the fat. So again, the fat supplies 2 times more energy than what we get from our carbs. So the ability to use that fat depends on the intensity of the exercise. So it becomes more important as the duration increases. So again, if we're jogging for 20 minutes, probably just going to be using carbohydrates. But if you're jogging or exercising for an hour, now you're burning more fat for those longer durations. So again, during a 5-mile run, it's about 50-50. So about half the time you'll be using fats, half the time you'll be using carbs. Now how this works, so if we have a 16 carbon fatty acid, all of those carbons are going to come off to form carbon dioxide. So we would have 16 carbon dioxides released here. But again, we get 108 ATP molecules from that one fatty acid molecule. So the ATP is yielded from aerobic. So aerobic needs oxygen for that. And each triglyceride, remember, it has 3 fatty acids. So we're getting this 108 up here from 1 fatty acid. Each triglyceride, though, has 3. So now we're going to multiply this 108 times 3 to equal 1 triglyceride. So again, lots more energy from our triglycerides than we get from our carbs. All right, so this fuel use and intensity. So at rest, there's nearly equal amounts of carbs and fats used to generate our ATP. Now, as the activity intensifies, anaerobic supplies our quick fuel. Those proportions of carbs is actually going to increase. Now, except during those endurance, and again, endurance, little protein is actually used for fuel. So if we look here at our proteins, our carbs, and our fat as far as being a fuel source, you'll see it really doesn't matter on the intensity. Proteins all kind of stay about the same. So just a little bit of protein, so we just don't even really talk about it much. The main thing we're looking at is as we move from a low to high intensity, what you can see here is that by the time we get to high intensity, those are mainly using carbs for energy, just a little bit of fat. But down at the low intensity, we're using a lot more fat for energy than we are of the carbs. So again, high intensity, lots of carbs being used, little fat. Low intensity, we're using more fat and less carbs. Now, how the ATP actually gets made here from fats, proteins, and carbs. So again, our proteins are mainly used for body structures, not really for energy, but we can break them down when we need to make those different amino acids. The amino acids can enter in here to different parts of the aerobic process, namely this electron transport that is releasing that carbon dioxide and water. Again, the goal here, though, is all that ATP. Now our carbs, again, our glycogen is going to be broken down. That releases glucose. We go through a process called glycolysis and what's called the citric acid cycle. But again, ultimately ending here with this electron transport and lots of energy being produced as long as oxygen's available for that last step. Then our fats can also be broken down into those fatty acids from triglycerides. They enter the citric acid cycle. They go to electron transport, so we're still getting lots and lots of energy that's produced. Now, looking at our role of protein, again, as we mentioned, during rest and low to moderate intensity, only about 5% is going to be coming from our proteins. Now, as we get into endurance, where we're using energy for longer periods, we might use up some more of those proteins to meet that energy demand. And the branched chains are the ones that give us the most energy, but resistance exercises, even if it's endurance and holding them for longer, still uses less protein than like a jog for an hour. So the average dietary pattern should provide ample amounts of all of our amino acids. We don't need to have supplements because, again, we're not using a lot of protein for our physical activity.